The sun was setting, casting a dull orange glow over the small electronics shop that John Arthur had owned for over 15 years. The days were long, and lately they felt even longer, as if time itself had slowed down, refusing to grant him even a moment of peace. His shop, Arthur's Tech Haven, wasn't anything special. It was just another place on the corner of Main Street, wedged between a thrift store and an old barber shop that had seen better days. John leaned on the counter, tapping his fingers impatiently. It had been a slow day, and he couldn't wait to go home. His lower back ached from standing all day, and his head throbbed with the remnants of a headache that had followed him since the morning. The bell above the door jingled, drawing John's attention. He groaned inwardly when he saw who had walked in. A tall, elderly black man with a weathered face and graying hair. The man wore a faded brown coat that looked a bit too big for him, and he carried an old beat-up satchel slung over his shoulder. "Great," John muttered under his breath, feeling the familiar irritation bubble up. "Just what I needed." The man didn't seem to notice John's discomfort as he slowly made his way to the shelves at the back, squinting at the small print on the product labels. He moved with a careful, deliberate grace, as if every step was measured. He finally stopped in front of a row of portable radios, and John could see him reaching out with trembling fingers to pick one up. "Can I help you with something?" John called out, trying to keep the impatience out of his voice. The old man turned and smiled, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "Thank you, son," he said in a voice that was surprisingly deep and strong despite his frail appearance. "I'm looking for a replacement battery for this old thing." He reached into his satchel and pulled out an ancient-looking radio, one that must have been at least 30 years old. John stared at the radio, suppressing a sigh. "That's a pretty outdated model," he said. "You'd be better off buying a new one. We've got a sale on the newer versions." The old man shook his head, smiling. "Oh, I'm sure you do. But this one's special. Belonged to my late wife. We used to listen to it together every evening. Can't bring myself to replace it, you understand." John felt a flicker of empathy, brief, almost unnoticeable, but it was quickly swallowed up by his irritation. "Well, you're not going to find batteries for that model here," he said, more sharply than he intended. "We only carry the newer stuff." The man's smile faltered, but he nodded, clearly not wanting to cause any trouble. "I see," he murmured, glancing around the shop one last time. "Thank you anyway." As the man turned to leave, John felt an odd sense of guilt tugging at him, but he quickly shoved it aside. "Waste of my time," he muttered, watching the man shuffle out of the shop. "These people always want something for nothing." He flipped the sign on the door from open to closed and started tidying up, his mind drifting back to the old man's story about his wife. It made him think about his own life, about Sarah and Mark, about how they used to be closer, happier, but those days felt like a distant memory now. He locked up the shop, stepped out into the chilly evening air, and began the short walk home. As he walked, he noticed the old man sitting on a bench a little further down the street, struggling to get the radio back into his satchel. For a moment, John thought about approaching him, about offering some kind of help, or maybe even an apology. But then the old resentment flared up again, and he kept walking. "Not my problem," he told himself, picking up his pace. "I've got my own issues to worry about." By the time John arrived home, the sun had dipped below the horizon, leaving the sky a deep shade of purple. He could see the soft glow of the kitchen lights through the windows, and he felt a pang of longing as he stepped through the front door. The scent of Sarah's cooking greeted him, warm and familiar, but it did little to lift his spirits. "Hey, you're home," Sarah called from the kitchen. "Dinner's almost ready." John grunted in response, tossing his keys onto the hallway table. He could hear the sound of pots clattering, the sizzle of something frying on the stove. It was the same routine every evening, and while he appreciated her efforts, he couldn't shake the feeling of weariness that had settled deep in his bones. "Where's Mark?" John asked, leaning against the doorway. "He's upstairs working on a project for school," Sarah replied, not looking up from the stove. "He said he's bringing a friend over tomorrow to help him finish it. I hope that's okay." John's jaw tightened. "Who?" "I think his name is Damon," Sarah said. "You remember him, right? He's been over a few times." John's expression darkened. "Yeah, I remember," he muttered. "That's the black kid, isn't it?" Sarah sighed, her shoulders tensing. "Yes, John. He's Mark's friend. Please don't make this a thing." "Make what a thing?" John shot back, a defensive edge creeping into his voice. "I just don't see why Mark has to hang around with people like that." People like what? Sarah snapped, finally turning to face him. John, Damon is a good kid. He's polite, respectful, and he's never given us any reason to dislike him. You don't even know him. I know enough, John muttered, refusing to meet her gaze. He could feel the argument brewing, the familiar tension that seemed to hang over them like a storm cloud. Do you? Sarah challenged, her voice rising. Because it seems to me that you've already decided who he is based on nothing but the color of his skin. Is that really the kind of example you want to set for our son? John didn't answer. He turned away, feeling the weight of her words pressing down on him, suffocating him. I'm going to bed, he muttered. I've had a long day. That night, John lay awake, staring at the ceiling, his mind replaying the events of the day. He thought about the old man in the shop, about the way his face had fallen when John refused to help him. He thought about Damon, about the resentment he felt every time he saw him with Mark, and he thought about Sarah's words, each one a needle pricking at his conscience. You don't even know him. It was true. He didn't know Damon. He didn't know the old man. He didn't know any of the people he looked down on, judged and dismissed without a second thought. But that didn't matter to him. He had his reasons, his justifications, and he'd been holding on to them for so long that they'd become a part of him. Why should I change? He whispered to the darkness. Why should I care? But deep down, in the part of himself that he tried so hard to ignore, he already knew the answer. The next day, as John sat behind the counter of his shop, he couldn't help but glance at the empty spot where the old man had stood. He felt a flicker of regret, but it was quickly swallowed up by the familiar bitterness that always seemed to be lurking just beneath the surface. The doorbell jingled again, and this time it was a young couple, both African American, holding hands as they browsed the store. They laughed together as they examined some headphones, clearly enjoying each other's company. John's mood soured instantly. He kept an eye on them, watching their every move, waiting for any excuse to kick them out. But they simply chose their product, paid for it with exact change, and left with a polite nod. Thank you, the woman said with a warm smile, but John barely acknowledged her. As soon as they were gone, he let out a frustrated breath. Why can't they just shop somewhere else? He muttered under his breath, though he knew no one could hear him. But as the hours passed and the shop emptied out, John found himself thinking about the old man's smile, about the couple's laughter, about Damon's polite greeting the first time they met. Maybe I've got it wrong, he thought, just for a moment. But then he shook his head, pushing the thought away. No, I've got enough on my plate without worrying about them. But even as he told himself that, he couldn't quite shake the feeling that something was shifting, something he didn't yet understand. And for the first time in a long time, John Arthur felt afraid, not of others, but of himself. John stood behind the counter, lost in thought, staring absently at a loose screw that had rolled across the glass surface. He was trying to remember when he'd last felt fully rested or free from pain. It wasn't just the exhaustion that was getting to him. The headaches had become a daily companion, and the tightness in his chest was now so familiar that he hardly noticed it anymore. He chalked it up to stress, to the endless parade of people he had to deal with each day, to the responsibility of running a business that was just barely staying afloat. The bell above the door chimed, and John looked up, instinctively tensing. But this time, it wasn't a customer. It was Mark, his son, with that usual burst of youthful energy and a bright grin plastered across his face. Hey, Dad, Mark greeted cheerfully. Mom sent me to see if you wanted lunch. John's shoulders relaxed and he managed a tired smile. Thanks, kiddo. You didn't have to come all the way down here. It's no big deal, Mark said, shrugging. Figured I'd keep you company for a bit. John couldn't help but feel a surge of pride. Despite everything, despite the tension that sometimes simmered between them, Mark was a good kid, better than he deserved, really. They sat down at a small table near the back of the store, where Mark unpacked a couple of sandwiches. As they ate, John felt another wave of dizziness wash over him. He clenched his jaw, willing it to pass, but Mark noticed. You okay, Dad? He asked, frowning. Yeah, John muttered, brushing it off. Just a little tired, that's all. You've been saying that a lot lately, Mark pointed out, concern etched on his young face. Maybe you should see a doctor. I'm fine, John snapped, more harshly than he intended. Mark recoiled slightly, and guilt twisted in John's gut. Sorry, he muttered, rubbing his temples. It's just been a rough couple of weeks, you know? Mark nodded slowly but didn't press the issue. They finished their lunch in silence, and after Mark left, John found himself staring at the door long after it had swung shut. That night, the pain became unbearable. It started as a dull ache in his chest, but as the hours dragged on, it grew sharper, more insistent. By midnight, John was doubled over in agony, clutching his chest as beads of sweat gathered on his forehead. He tried to tell himself that it was just stress, that it would pass. But when Sarah found him on the bathroom floor, gasping for breath, there was no more pretending. "We're going to the hospital," she said firmly, her voice tinged with panic. Now, John," she yelled, tears welling up in her eyes. "Please." The drive to the hospital was a blur, the streetlights flashing past like ghostly lanterns. John felt like he was floating in and out of consciousness, the pain pulsing in time with his heartbeat. Sarah kept one hand on the steering wheel and the other on his arm, her knuckles white. They arrived at the emergency room, where nurses immediately took him in, hooking him up to machines, asking questions that he could barely comprehend. Everything was a haze, the beeping monitors, the antiseptic smell, the cold sting of needles piercing his skin. After what felt like hours, a doctor entered the room. She was a middle-aged woman with graying hair and tired eyes, but there was a kindness in her gaze that put John at ease, if only for a moment. Sarah sat beside him, her fingers entwined with his, her face pale with worry. "Mr. Arthur," the doctor began, glancing at her clipboard, "I have some news and it's serious." John's heart skipped a beat. "How serious?" he croaked. The doctor took a breath. "You have advanced stage lung cancer. The scans show it's quite aggressive, and it's already spread to several lymph nodes." Sarah gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. John felt like the world was crumbling around him, the air sucked out of the room. "But I don't even smoke," he stammered, grasping for anything that might make this less real, less terrifying. "I know," the doctor said gently. "It's not always about smoking, Mr. Arthur. There can be other factors, environmental, genetic. But what's important now is that we start treatment as soon as possible." "How much time?" John whispered. "How much time do I have?" "It's hard to say," the doctor admitted. "With treatment, you could have a year, maybe more. But without it, a few months at most." John closed his eyes, feeling the weight of the words settling over him like a suffocating blanket. How could this be happening? How could everything fall apart so quickly? "Treatment will be expensive," the doctor continued. "Chemotherapy, radiation, possible surgery. It's not going to be easy, and there's no guarantee. But it's your best chance." Sarah's grip on his hand tightened, and when John opened his eyes, he saw the determination burning in hers. "We'll do whatever it takes," she said fiercely. The drive home was silent, each of them lost in their own thoughts. It wasn't until they pulled into the driveway that Sarah finally spoke. "We'll figure it out, John," she said, though her voice trembled. "We always do." But John wasn't so sure this time. The reality of their situation loomed over him like a storm cloud, and all he could see were the mounting bills, the endless treatments, and the knowledge that he was dragging his family down with him. That night, as they lay in bed, John stared at the ceiling, feeling the darkness pressing in on him. Sarah had fallen into a restless sleep, but he could tell from the way her fingers twitched and her breath hitched that even in dreams she wasn't at peace. John hated himself in that moment. He hated his weakness, his fear, and most of all, the way he had spent his life pushing people away. He thought of the old man with the radio, of the young couple in his shop, of Damon, and of every person he had ever judged without knowing. "I've wasted so much time," he whispered, tears spilling down his cheeks. But there was no one to hear him. The next morning, John tried to put on a brave face, but Mark knew something was wrong the moment he walked into the kitchen. "What happened?" he asked, his voice tight with worry. John swallowed hard. I've got cancer, son." The words hung heavy in the air, and for a moment, Mark just stood there, stunned into silence. Then, without warning, he crossed the room and threw his arms around his father, holding him as if he might disappear at any moment. "It's going to be okay," Mark said, but his voice cracked, betraying his fear. "We'll get through this, Dad. I promise." John held him close, feeling the warmth of his son's embrace, the unshakable love that poured from him. "I'm scared, Mark," he admitted, his voice barely a whisper. "I don't want to leave you and your mother." "You won't," Mark said fiercely. "We'll fight this, together." In the weeks that followed, John's life became a blur of doctor's appointments, tests, and consultations. Each time they visited the hospital, they left with more questions than answers, more doubts than hopes. And all the while, the bills piled up, each one a reminder of how precarious their situation was. One night, as John sat at the kitchen table, staring at the latest medical bill, he felt something inside him break. He couldn't do this. He couldn't drag his family through this nightmare, couldn't bear to see them suffer because of him. When Sarah entered the room, she found him sitting in the dark, his shoulders slumped, his eyes hollow. "John?" she asked softly, touching his arm. "What's wrong?" "We can't afford this," he said, his voice rough with despair. "We're going to lose everything. The house, the shop, everything." "We'll figure it out," she insisted, though even she sounded less certain now. "We always do." "No," John said, shaking his head. "Not this time. I don't want you and Mark to go bankrupt because of me. Maybe it would be better if I just—" "Don't you dare finish that sentence," Sarah interrupted, tears streaming down her face. "You're not giving up. You're not leaving us. We need you, John. We need you to fight." John looked into her eyes and saw the raw pain, the fear, but also the fierce determination that had always drawn him to her. He nodded, though he felt anything but certain. "I'll try," he whispered, and for the first time he meant it. But as the days passed, as the treatments began and the side effects ravaged his body, John began to wonder if trying would ever be enough. The pain in John's body was relentless, a constant reminder of the battle he was facing. As the days turned into weeks, the treatments grew more intense, and so did the side effect. His once strong frame had withered, his skin grew pale and ashen, and his eyes, which had always been sharp and alert, were now dull with fatigue. He spent more time in bed than out of it, and every time he caught a glimpse of himself in the mirror, he hardly recognized the man staring back. One afternoon, as John was resting in his bedroom, the faint sound of voices drifted up from the kitchen. He could hear Mark's unmistakable laugh, and another voice, one that had become familiar over the past few weeks. Damon had been coming over more frequently to help Mark with their school projects, and though John had never directly interacted with him beyond a forced greeting or a passing glance, he couldn't deny the comfort of hearing his son laugh again. It was a sound that had been missing from their home ever since the diagnosis. But today, Damon's voice wasn't just cheerful. There was a softness to it, a sincerity that drew John's attention. He shifted in bed, trying to make out the words, but his strength failed him. With a heavy sigh, he closed his eyes, letting the voices become a soothing background as he drifted in and out of sleep. Downstairs, Mark and Damon were seated at the kitchen table, textbooks sprawled out in front of them. They'd been working on a project for hours, but Damon noticed that Mark had barely said a word. His usual enthusiasm was gone, replaced by an exhaustion that Damon recognized all too well. "Hey, are you okay?" Damon asked gently, nudging Mark's arm. "You seem a little out of it." Mark sighed, running a hand through his hair. "It's just everything," he confessed. "With my dad being sick and all, the bills keep piling up, and we're running out of options. I don't know what we're going to do if we can't find the money for his treatment." Damon listened intently, his heart aching for his friend. He knew that Mark's family was struggling, but hearing it spelled out so plainly made it feel more real, more urgent. "Is there anything I can do to help?" he offered, even though he already knew the answer. Mark shook his head. "I don't think so. We've tried everything, loans, charities, asking family for help. Nothing's worked. My dad's getting worse, and I feel so helpless." Damon sat back, processing Mark's words. He thought about his own family, how they had always managed to get by, even when times were tough. But he also thought about how much it had meant when people had reached out to help them, even in small ways. "What if we tried something different?" Damon suggested, his mind racing with possibilities. "Something online, maybe?" "Like what?" Mark asked, frowning. "I don't know," Damon said slowly, as the idea began to take shape. "But I've been learning how to build websites recently. What if we created a site to share your dad's story? Maybe we could start a fundraiser or something." Mark looked skeptical. "Do you really think that would work?" "I think it's worth a shot," Damon said earnestly. "You'd be surprised at how generous people can be. Sometimes all they need is to hear the right story. But my dad—" Mark hesitated, glancing toward the stairs that led to John's bedroom. "He's so proud. I don't know if he'd be okay with it." "Then maybe we don't tell him," Damon suggested with a small smile. "At least not at first. Let's see if we can get something started. If it takes off, we can show him then." Mark studied Damon for a long moment, and finally, a spark of hope flickered in his eyes. "Okay," he said quietly. "Let's do it." That night, While most of the town slept, Damon sat in front of his computer, his fingers flying across the keyboard. He worked tirelessly, driven by the urgency of the situation and a deep desire to help his friend. He poured his heart into every line of code, every paragraph of text, crafting a story that would capture the essence of the Arthur family, their love, their strength, and the immense challenge they were facing. The website, titled Hope for John, came to life in a matter of days. Damon included pictures of John from better times smiling with his family, working at his shop, and spending time with Mark. He wrote about the struggle that had come crashing into their lives, the toll it had taken, and the fear that now hung over them like a shadow. Damon added a donation button and set a modest goal, $10,000, just enough to cover the next round of treatment. He knew it was a long shot, but he believed in the power of community, in the possibility of people coming together to help a family in need. When the site was finally ready, Damon showed it to Mark, who was moved to tears. "It's perfect," Mark said, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you, Damon. I don't know how to thank you." "You don't have to," Damon replied. "We're in this together." At first, the donations trickled in slowly, a few dollars here, $20 there. But then something incredible happened. One of Damon's friends shared the link on social media, and soon the story spread like wildfire. People from all over the community began donating, sharing words of encouragement, and offering prayers for John's recovery. By the end of the first week, they had raised over $5,000, and the total kept climbing. Mark could hardly believe it. He checked the website obsessively, watching in awe as the numbers grew, as strangers reached out with kindness and compassion that left him speechless. But they couldn't keep it a secret forever. One evening, as John lay in bed, too weak to do much more than stare at the ceiling, Sarah walked in, holding her phone. "John," she said gently, sitting down beside him, "there's something you need to see." "What is it?" he asked, frowning. She handed him the phone, and he squinted at the screen. The website loaded, and as he began to read, his heart sank. "Hope for John," he murmured. "What is this?" "It's a fundraiser," Sarah explained. "Mark and Damon started it. They didn't want to tell you until they were sure it would work." John felt a surge of emotions, anger, shame, disbelief, but more than anything he felt humbled. "Why would they do this?" he whispered, more to himself than to Sarah. "Because they love you," she said simply. "Because they're not ready to give up, and because they believe that there are people out there who care." John scrolled through the page, his eyes welling up as he read the messages of support, the names of people who had donated. Some he recognized, many he didn't. There were people from his own town, from across the state, even from other countries. How much have they raised?" he asked, his voice trembling. "Almost $8,000, Sarah replied, tears streaming down her face. "Enough for the next treatment." John stared at the screen, his heart swelling with an emotion he hadn't felt in years. "I don't deserve this," he choked out. "I've been so angry, so bitter. I don't deserve any of this." "That's not true," Sarah said, squeezing his hand. "You're a good man, John. You've just lost your way. But it's not too late. It's never too late." John felt something break inside him, the walls he had built around his heart crumbling under the weight of Sarah's words. Damon's kindness, and the overwhelming generosity of strangers. He looked up at his wife, and for the first time in a long time, he allowed himself to hope. Later that week, Mark brought Damon over to the house to discuss the fundraiser's progress. John insisted on joining them, despite his frail state, and when Damon entered the living room, John met his eyes for the first time. "Thank you," John said, his voice rough with emotion. "I don't know how to repay you for what you've done." Damon shook his head, smiling. "You don't need to repay me, Mr. Arthur. I did it because it was the right thing to do, and because Mark is my friend." John nodded, swallowing hard. "I want you to know that I'm sorry," he said, "for the way I've treated you, for the things I've said. I'm sorry." Damon's smile widened, and he extended his hand. "It's okay, Mr. Arthur. We all make mistakes. What matters is that we learn from them." John took Damon's hand, and in that moment, he felt something shift inside him, a lightness, a warmth that he hadn't felt in years. It was as if, for the first time, he could see Damon for who he truly was, not just a black kid, not just Mark's friend, but a young man with a kind heart, a strong spirit, and a willingness to reach out a hand to someone in need. And in that moment, John knew that he had been given a second chance, not just at life, but at being the man he always should have been. The news of John Arthur's fundraiser continued to spread, reaching people far beyond the small town where he lived. Within a few weeks, the website Damon had created was featured on local news stations, and soon after, regional media outlets picked up the story. It seemed that everyone was talking about the remarkable young man who had gone out of his way to help his friend's father, even though that father had harbored prejudiced feelings against him. Donations began pouring in from all over the country. Messages of hope and encouragement filled the website, and people shared their own stories of battling illness, overcoming adversity, and the power of kindness. Every day, Mark would sit with John, showing him the latest updates, reading aloud the comments from strangers who had been moved by his story. "Dad, look at this one," Mark said one afternoon, scrolling through the site. "This woman donated $200 and wrote that she lost her husband to cancer last year, but she wants to help because she knows how hard it is to fight alone." John listened in silence, his throat tight with emotion. Each message felt like another crack in the armor he had worn for so many years, exposing him to a world he had spent most of his life pushing away. It was overwhelming to feel so much kindness, so much compassion from people he had never met. "Why?" he finally whispered, looking up at his son. "Why are they doing this for me?" "Because they see something worth saving," Mark replied softly. "And so do I." The next day, Damon arrived at the Arthur house with a laptop under his arm and a stack of printed emails in his hand. He greeted John and Sarah with a warm smile, as if he were a member of the family, and sat down at the kitchen table. John watched him, still struggling to reconcile this young man's kindness with the bitterness he had carried for so long. "Mr. Arthur," Damon said, his tone respectful yet friendly, "I wanted to show you some of the people who have reached out to help. I think you should see just how many lives you've touched." Damon opened his laptop and began scrolling through the website, showing John the names of donors, the amounts they had contributed, and the messages they had left. There were hundreds, then thousands, each one a testament to the impact that a single act of kindness could have. Damon even showed John a map, with dots representing every place in the country where someone had contributed to his cause. "It's amazing," John said, shaking his head in disbelief. I never imagined people could care so much. People have a lot more in common than we realize," Damon replied, looking John in the eye. "Sometimes all it takes is for someone to show a little bit of heart." John stared at him, the weight of Damon's words pressing down on him. "You're a better man than I ever was," he admitted, his voice barely more than a whisper. "I've spent so much of my life judging people, pushing them away because of my own fears, my own ignorance, and now, here you are, doing more for me than I ever did for anyone else." Damon reached out and placed his hand on John's. "It's never too late to change, Mr. Arthur," he said gently. "It's never too late to be the person you want to be." That evening, John found himself alone in the living room, gazing at a faded family photo on the mantelpiece. It was taken many years ago, back when Mark was just a little boy, and before life had hardened him into the man he had become. He barely recognized the man in the photo, the man with a carefree smile, his arm wrapped around Sarah's shoulders. "How did I get here?" he muttered to himself, feeling the sting of regret. He thought about his father, a man who had always told him to stick to your own kind and don't trust people who don't look like you. John had carried those words with him his whole life, never once questioning them, never once challenging the beliefs that had been handed down to him like a legacy. But now, faced with his own mortality, he realized how empty those beliefs were, how they had done nothing but build walls around him, walls that had kept him isolated, bitter, and alone. Maybe Damon's right, he thought, a glimmer of hope flickering in his heart. Maybe it's not too late. The next morning, John made a decision. He asked Mark and Damon to help him back into the living room, where they had set up the computer with the website. Damon adjusted the monitor so that John could see it clearly, and then he stepped back, waiting to see what John would do. "I want to write something," John said, his voice shaking with emotion. "A message to everyone who's helped me." "Of course," Damon replied, quickly opening a new post on the website. He handed the keyboard to John, and then he and Mark stepped back, giving John the space he needed. John stared at the blinking cursor for a long time, his mind racing with everything he wanted to say. He thought about the old man with the radio, about the young couple in his shop, about every person he had ever dismissed or judged because of the color of their skin. He thought about Damon, about his kindness, his patience, and the way he had reached out a hand when no one else would. And then he began to type. "To everyone who has shown me kindness, To everyone who has donated, prayed, and sent words of encouragement, I want to say thank you. You've given me more than just hope. You've given me a reason to fight, to keep going, even when I thought there was nothing left. I've spent most of my life believing that people were different, that we couldn't understand each other. But you've proven me wrong. You've shown me that we're all the same, that we all have the capacity to love, to care, and to make a difference. I can't change the past, and I can't undo the mistakes I've made. But I can promise you this, I will spend whatever time I have left becoming a better man, a man who sees people for who they are, not what they look like. Thank you for giving me that chance. When John finished, he handed the keyboard back to Damon, who was blinking back tears. Mark reached out and squeezed his father's shoulder, his eyes shining with pride. I'm proud of you, Dad, he said softly. I always have been. John smiled, feeling a warmth spread through his chest that had nothing to do with the treatments, the medications, or the pain. It was the warmth of love, of acceptance, of knowing that he was not alone. The post quickly went viral, spreading across social media and sparking conversations all over the country. People shared John's message, using it as an example of how change was possible, how even the most hardened hearts could be softened by kindness and compassion. News outlets reached out for interviews, and John's story became a symbol of hope and unity in a time when so many felt divided. One afternoon, a news crew came to the Arthur home to film a segment for a local television station. They set up their cameras in the living room, where John, Sarah, Mark, and Damon sat together on the couch. The reporter, a young black woman named Alicia, smiled as she adjusted her microphone. Mr. Arthur, your story has touched so many people. Can you tell us what this journey has been like for you? John took a deep breath, glancing at Damon before he answered. It's been humbling, he said. I've spent so much of my life believing that people were different, that we couldn't understand each other. But this experience has shown me that we're all capable of incredible kindness, regardless of where we come from or what we look like. Alicia nodded, her eyes soft with understanding. And Damon, she continued, turning to him, you were the one who started the fundraiser. What made you want to help? Damon smiled. It wasn't really a decision, he said. It was just the right thing to do. I've always believed that we have a responsibility to help each other, especially when someone's struggling, and I knew that if we could come together, we could make a difference. The interview ended with a round of applause from the crew, and as they packed up their equipment, Alicia leaned in close to John. Thank you, she whispered, for sharing your story. It's given a lot of people hope. As John watched them leave, he felt a sense of peace wash over him. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't afraid of the future. He knew that whatever happened next, he wouldn't face it alone. He looked at Damon, who was laughing with Mark in the kitchen, and felt a surge of gratitude. Thank you, he whispered, though Damon couldn't hear him. Thank you for helping me find my way back. As the days passed, the impact of John's message rippled far beyond the boundaries of their small town. More people shared his post, and it sparked debates on television shows, podcasts, and social media platforms about the potential for personal transformation and the power of empathy. Many were inspired by John's willingness to confront his past and embrace change, while others remained skeptical, questioning whether someone could truly let go of deeply ingrained prejudices. But John wasn't concerned with the opinions of those who doubted him. For the first time in years, he was focused on something far more important, rebuilding the relationships that mattered most to him, starting with his family. John's health had stabilized for the moment, thanks to the treatments funded by the donations. He had more energy now, and though the cancer still cast a shadow over their lives, he was able to participate more actively in family life. The color was slowly returning to his face, and his movements, though slow and deliberate, no longer carried the same weight of defeat they once had. One Sunday afternoon, John asked Sarah if they could take a drive. It had been months since he'd left the house for anything other than a doctor's appointment, and he wanted to see the town again, to remind himself of the life he was fighting to keep. They drove in comfortable silence, the warm summer breeze drifting in through the open windows. As they passed through familiar streets, John noticed the small ways the town had changed. New storefronts, freshly painted murals on brick walls, and a park where the children were playing. "Do you want to stop?" Sarah asked, catching the wistful look in his eyes. John nodded, swallowing the lump that had formed in his throat. "Yeah," he said, his voice barely more than a whisper. "I'd like that." They pulled into the parking lot, and as John stepped out of the car, He took a moment to steady himself, leaning on his cane for support. He had lost so much weight during his illness that his clothes hung loosely on his frame, but he stood taller now, with a quiet strength that had been missing for a long time. As they walked toward the park, John noticed a group of people gathered around a picnic table. They were setting up banners and handing out flyers, and he recognized one of the women as a local activist who often volunteered at the community center. When she saw John and Sarah approaching, her eyes widened in surprise. "Mr. Arthur," she called out, waving them over. "It's so good to see you up and about." "Thank you," John replied, managing a smile. "What's all this?" "We're organizing a fundraiser for another family in town," she explained. "They're going through a tough time, and after hearing about your story, we thought we'd try to help them the way Damon helped you." John's heart swelled with emotion. "That's incredible," he said, shaking his head in disbelief. "I can't tell you how much it means to me to see the community coming together like this." "We were inspired by you, Mr. Arthur," the woman replied, her eyes shining. "You showed us that we can make a difference." Back at home, Damon continued to be a constant presence. He visited nearly every day, helping Mark with schoolwork, spending time with John, and even teaching Sarah how to navigate the website to keep track of donations and messages. One evening, after they had finished updating the fundraiser page, John turned to Damon. "I'd like to do something for you," he said, "to thank you for everything you've done." "You don't need to thank me, Mr. Arthur," Damon replied. "I was just doing what felt right." "But I do need to thank you," John insisted. "You didn't just help save my life, you helped me see the world differently, and that's something I can never repay." Damon hesitated, then said, "Well, there is something you could do." "Name it," John said. "Come with me to a community meeting," Damon replied. "It's an event we have every month to discuss issues affecting the neighborhood. We talk about things like education, healthcare, and ways we can support each other. I think it would mean a lot to the group if you shared your story." John felt a flicker of fear. The idea of standing in front of a group of strangers, of admitting his mistakes and confronting the pain he had caused, was terrifying. But as he looked into Damon's eyes, he saw nothing but encouragement and understanding. "Okay," he said, his voice trembling. "I'll do it." The following Thursday, John found himself in a small, crowded community center, seated on a folding chair next to Damon. The room was filled with people of all ages and backgrounds, Black, white, Latino, Asian, each one eager to listen and contribute. John's heart pounded in his chest, and for a moment he considered leaving, but Damon gave him a reassuring nod. When it was John's turn to speak, he stood up slowly, gripping his cane for support. Every eye in the room was on him, and he took a deep breath before beginning. "My name is John Arthur," he said, his voice shaking. "And I've made a lot of mistakes in my life." He spoke about his upbringing, about the prejudices he had inherited from his father, and the bitterness that had taken root in his heart. He talked about the way he had treated people, the assumptions he had made, and the walls he had built to keep others out. "And then I got sick," he continued, his voice breaking. "And I thought that was the end. I thought I was going to die alone, angry, and filled with regret. But then something amazing happened. My son's friend, Damon, showed me a kindness I didn't deserve. He started a fundraiser, he shared my story, and he showed me that there's always hope, even when you've lost your way." Tears filled his eyes as he looked at Damon. "He saved my life, and in doing so, he showed me that it's never too late to change." When John finished speaking, the room was silent for a moment. Then, one by one, people began to clap. It started as a soft, hesitant sound, but quickly grew into a wave of applause that filled the room, echoing off the walls. John looked around, overwhelmed by the support, and saw that many people had tears in their eyes. As he sat down, Damon leaned over and whispered, "You did great." "Thank you," John whispered back, his heart swelling with gratitude. "Thank you for giving me the chance." In the weeks that followed, John's life continued to change in ways he never could have imagined. People from the community stopped by his shop, not just to buy electronics, but to talk, to share their own stories, and to thank him for his courage. Many of them had experienced prejudice and hardship in their own lives, and they saw in John a symbol of hope, proof that even the most deeply ingrained beliefs could be challenged and transformed. One afternoon, as John was sweeping the floor of his shop, the doorbell jingled, and he looked up to see the old man who had visited months ago, the one with the broken radio. He was holding the same faded satchel, but this time there was a smile on his face. "Hello, Mr. Arthur," the man said, his voice warm and friendly. John's heart skipped a beat. "You came back," he said, hardly believing his eyes. "I heard about what you've been through," the old man replied, "and I wanted to say, I'm proud of you." Tears welled up in John's eyes, and he nodded, unable to find the words to express his gratitude. "Thank you," he finally managed. "That means more to me than you'll ever know." The old man reached into his satchel and pulled out the radio, placing it gently on the counter. "I thought maybe you could help me fix this after all," he said with a twinkle in his eye. John laughed, a genuine, joyful sound that felt like a weight lifting off his chest. "I'd be honored," he said. As the sun dipped below the horizon that evening, John stood outside his shop, watching as the sky turned shades of pink and gold. He thought about everything that had happened, the illness, the fundraiser, the friends he had made, and the lessons he had learned. And for the first time in a long time, he felt a sense of peace, a certainty that no matter what the future held, he wouldn't face it alone. "Thank you," he whispered to the wind, to the people who had helped him, and to the young man who had shown him the way. "Thank you for giving me a second chance." The news about John's remarkable transformation continued to spread. What began as a local story of compassion had now reached a national audience. Journalists, bloggers, and television networks were all captivated by the idea that a man, hardened by years of prejudice, had experienced a profound change of heart in the face of his greatest challenge. The website Damon had created had now surpassed its goal many times over, more than just covering John's medical bills. The fundraiser was now flush with enough contributions to not only sustain his treatment, but to support other families in need as well. Inspired by Damon's selflessness and John's journey, people started reaching out, offering help, and requesting ways to contribute to the lives of others facing similar struggles. Seeing how their efforts had touched so many lives, Damon proposed an idea to John during one of his visits. "I've been thinking," he began tentatively, "about how much this fundraiser has meant to you and your family. I was wondering, what if we turned it into something bigger?" "What do you mean?" John asked, genuinely curious. "We could start a foundation," Damon explained. "Something that could help families who are going through similar struggles. We could provide financial support, connect them with resources, and make sure they don't have to face their battles alone." John blinked, trying to process the enormity of Damon's suggestion. "You mean, use the money we've raised to help others?" "Exactly," Damon said, his eyes shining with excitement. "We could call it the Second Chance Foundation." John felt a swell of emotion rise in his chest. He thought about all the people who had donated, all the messages of hope and encouragement, all the kindness that had come from complete strangers. The idea of being able to pass that kindness on to others was almost overwhelming. "You'd do that?" John asked, his voice cracking. "You'd help me do that?" "Of course," Damon replied without hesitation. "You've taught me something, Mr. Arthur, that it's never too late to make a difference." John nodded, feeling tears well up in his eyes. He reached out and pulled Damon into a hug, holding on tightly as if afraid that this young man, the one who had saved his life, might suddenly disappear. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for everything." A few months later, the Second Chance Foundation officially launched with an event held at the very community center where John had first shared his story. The room was packed with people, friends, family, neighbors, even strangers who had been touched by John's journey. Damon stood beside John as they addressed the crowd together, their partnership a symbol of what could be achieved when people set aside their differences and work toward a common goal. John stepped up to the microphone, glancing around the room at all the faces looking back at him with anticipation. He took a deep breath, steadying himself as he began to speak. "There was a time," he said slowly, "when I believed that I knew everything about the world. I thought I had all the answers, that my way of seeing things was the only way. But I was wrong, and it took getting sick, nearly losing everything I cared about, to open my eyes." He paused, his gaze drifting over to Damon. "It also took someone extraordinary to help me see the truth. Damon didn't just help save my life, he showed me that there's always room for hope, for change, and for redemption." There was a murmur of agreement from the crowd, and John felt a surge of courage. "This foundation isn't just about helping me," he continued. "It's about helping all the people who feel lost, who feel like they don't have anyone to turn to. It's about proving that no matter how dark things seem, there's always a light. And sometimes, that light comes from the most unexpected places." The room erupted into applause, and John stepped back from the microphone, overwhelmed by the support. He caught Damon's eye, and the young man gave him a thumbs up, a proud smile spreading across his face. A surprise visit a few weeks later, as John was working in his shop, now fully reopened and thriving, thanks to the community's support, he heard the familiar jingle of the doorbell. Looking up, he saw a man standing there, holding a large envelope. The man was in his mid-50s, with a neatly trimmed beard and a tailored suit that spoke of success and wealth. "Mr. Arthur?" the man asked. "That's me," John replied, setting down the items he had been sorting. "How can I help you?" The man stepped forward and extended his hand. "My name's Richard Owens. I'm a partner at a law firm in the city, and I've come a long way to meet you." "Is that so?" John said, shaking his hand, still puzzled. "What brings you all the way out here?" "I've been following your story," Richard said, looking around the shop. "I have to say, it's inspiring. It reminds me of something my father once told me, that there's always a chance for redemption, no matter how far gone you think you are." John felt a pang in his chest. "Your father sounds like a wise man." "He was," Richard agreed. "But I didn't come here just to tell you that. I have something for you." He held out the envelope, and John took it hesitantly, tearing it open. Inside, there was a check. John's eyes widened as he stared at the number printed on it, a donation of $100,000 made out to the Second Chance Foundation. I don't understand," John stammered. "Why would you do this?" Richard smiled. "Because I believe in what you're doing," he said, "and because I've seen firsthand how much good can come from a second chance. I want to be a part of that." John stared at the check, his hands trembling. He had seen many donations come in, but nothing like this. "Thank you," he said, his voice breaking. "Thank you so much." "Don't thank me," Richard replied. "Just keep doing what you're doing. A new journey." The donation from Richard Owens allowed the foundation to expand its reach, helping more families struggling with medical bills, financial hardships, and emotional burdens. Damon took on a leadership role, managing the foundation's operations, while John became its spokesperson, traveling to schools, churches, and community centers to share his story. Each time John stood in front of a new audience, he felt the same nerves, the same doubts, but he also felt the same warmth, the knowledge that his words were making a difference, that he was helping others see the world through new eyes. One day, after speaking at a youth center, John was approached by a young man who looked to be about Damon's age. "Mr. Arthur," the young man said, his voice shaking, "I just wanted to say, thank you. I used to hate myself because of how people saw me, but hearing your story, it made me realize that I don't have to be defined by other people's expectations." John felt a lump form in his throat. He reached out and placed a hand on the young man's shoulder. "You define who you are," he said, "no one else, and you're going to do amazing things." A final goodbye months turned into years, and John's health continued to improve. Though he would never be fully cured, he had more good days than bad ones. The foundation grew, helping countless families, and Damon continued to thrive, his dedication inspiring others to follow in his footsteps. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, John stood on his porch, looking out at the town that had become his sanctuary. He thought about all the people who had come into his life, the old man with the radio, the young couple in his shop, the woman at the community meeting. He thought about Damon and how this remarkable young man had changed the course of his life. "Thank you," he whispered into the wind, his voice barely audible, "for giving me a second chance." As if in response, a breeze rustled through the trees, carrying with it the faint sound of laughter, of hope, of life. And for the first time in years, John felt truly at peace. He turned and walked back inside, where his family was waiting, where Damon was waiting. And in that moment, John knew that no matter what the future held, he had found his way home.